I am so excited to finally get out here to Lowndes County to film a little bit about the uprising, really, that happened here in the Great Depression and right after. And the two most important graves here are Eddie Bracy, who was killed, lynched by the white landlord mob, as it was said in the Daily Worker, over the ongoing strikes that were happening around Labor Day 1935, shot in the neck 19 times. And over here you've got Lemon Johnson, who is one of the central characters from the book Hammer and Hoe. And Lowndes County itself became kind of a nexus for very old school militant black self-defense and even self-determination.
I don't want your millions, mister. I don't want your diamond ring. All I want is the right to live, mister. Give me back my job again. Now I don't want your Rolls Royce, mister. I don't want...
And before I really dig into the meat of Eddie Bracy and Lemon Johnson, I do want to say I visited the Scottsboro Boys Museum last weekend, and I was told that basically this history was out of the textbooks beginning in the 1940s. Before then, it was talked about quite a bit, and you still have the book To Kill a Mockingbird, which was based off of the Scottsboro Boys. But after World War II, the censors started targeting anything that could be considered socialistic or communistic, and as the Cold War went on, generations passed, and people just stopped talking about these actual uprisings that happened in a lot of cases in the Black Belt. And this is a total chapter of history that's just been ripped out of the textbooks. Most Americans don't know this ever happened. I even spoke to some people at this church last week who knew Lemon Johnson and didn't seem to know that he was a left-winger. When I visited this church last week, I met a man who was actually very proud to show me where Lemon Johnson was buried, because he said that this man used to be his friend, and he purchased a plot of earth right here, directly in front of me, before he died. And I asked, well, why was that he purchased it so soon? Well, Lemon Johnson was a member of the Burial Society, and he was very good standing. He was, I believe he was in the choir, but the man said he seemed very intent on being buried here. And I think the reason for that is because his comrade from the Labor Day strikes of 1935 is buried right here, Eddie Bracy, who was shot 19 times in the neck in order to send a message to other strike leaders. Now, before I really dig into the meat of this video, I want to take a break and step back for a moment so you understand I'm not advertising the Communist Party. What I'm doing here is describing a radical union, the Sharecroppers Union, which was created independent of any left-wing organizing, which the communists then later tried to get involved in. If anything, it could be said that the communist activists wanted to take a militant approach that they knew would get blacks martyred in the Deep South, but didn't really care about the actual human cost of these efforts. And the blacks down here knew how to advocate in ways that didn't directly put their families at risk, but they did take a very close liking to the Communist Party's assertion that they should arm up to protect themselves and push for self-determination. This is what resonated with Ralph Gray, the leader of the Sharecroppers Union and its founder, when he wrote to some of the more radical unions like the Trade Union Unity League, asking to join with them. I'll talk later about the Trade Union Unity League, but TUL was basically a separate branch of the Communist Party that was advocating for unity between industrial and agricultural unions. Once they started bringing down their own radical activists, mostly from Chattanooga, the sheriff started to push back against them, and there was a shootout. In that shootout, Ralph Gray had his legs Tommy-gunned by a posse that went by him, and in the aftermath of that, because the sheriff was shot in the shoulder, White vigilantes patrolled around town, shotgunning anybody they saw out and about. This could have killed dozens of people, and no one really knows the full death toll of this incident, but it was called the Battle of Tallapoosa. In the aftermath of that, Mac Code made his way back to the safety of Chattanooga, and eventually to Republican Spain, where he fought for the International Brigades in the Spanish Civil War. He would die an old man in the 1960s in South Carolina, still mining for coal. But what happened with Ralph Gray's family is another matter entirely, and this is what wrapped up Lemon Johnson. Basically, after the assassination of Ralph Gray, his brother Tommy Gray took over regional SCU leadership in an absence of Communist Party officials. And all of this basically meant that Tom Gray was the local leader and landlords were trying to have him killed. Now, Tommy Gray was forced to keep his head down while his 19-year-old daughter, a woman named Eula Gray, more or less took up the reins of the radical SCU. And here in the book, Hammer and Hoe, Robin D.G. Kelly makes a very good point in the fact that the Communist Party really just looked past Eula Gray's leadership. In any case, Eula Gray continued SCU activities on behalf of the Communist Party, but without anybody there to tell her what to do. A young rural black woman from a poor family could organize this well without the guiding hand of the party, and that astounded District Bureau member Harry Wicks, who wrote about her dismissively. He said, and this is a quote, "The croppers themselves are maintaining their organization, and reports are that they are holding meetings regularly without any direction from us, except what this little girl can impart on them." Probably because they underestimated the importance of female leadership, the party passed Eula Gray up for leadership roles and took on Al Murphy. His leadership is widely praised by leftist historians, but the question of what could have happened if Eula Gray was allowed to stay in her leadership role still remains. Plus, the Gray family were influential in this county. After all, Ralph Gray and his brother Tommy were the grandsons of a radical Reconstruction Republican who had told the whites around him that he was willing to die in the Second Civil War if the rights of blacks were not recognized. This entire family had uplifted their community after Ralph had pulled himself up out of debt, bought his own car, and moved from farm to farm to advocate for joining the SCU. And still, the Communist Party passed up his brother's daughter because she was just a little girl, according to District Bureau member Harry Wicks. Whatever the case is regarding Eula Gray, Lemon Johnson then became the head of the SCU Regional in Hope Hull, Alabama, right here in Lowndes County. He was a very militant man, and like many other black militants in the Depression, he helped to construct a folk mythology around the Sharecroppers Union. At this time, they knew very well that they were tied to the Communist Party, but because of communist propaganda, they unconsciously tied their activities to activities inside of Russia, not to Comintern or to a coalition of leftist Americans training in Moscow. Lemon Johnson was convinced that Russian agents guided the Sharecroppers Union and the Communist Party in District 17 for at least a little while. There's a story in Hammer and Hoe in which he was speaking to some Northerners who were organizing secretly in rural eastern Alabama, and he let slip that he thought the Daily Worker, publications and leaflets, and other communist materials that he was reading were actually printed in Moscow. Johnson therefore praised the USSR and believed that their support was essential.
So I went and asked my mama why our neighbor called me Red. My mommy took me on her knee and this is what she said. Well, you ain't done nothing if you ain't been called a red. If you marched or agitated, it's bound to hear it said. So you might as well ignore it or love the word instead. 'Cause you ain't been doing nothing if you ain't been called a red.
Behind me is the grave of Eddie Bracy, who's buried at the foot of his close friend Lemon Johnson, who would go on to live out the rest of his natural life and die an elderly man. But Eddie wasn't so lucky, and he died a martyr around Labor Day 1935. That's because at the beginning of September, hundreds of black sharecroppers here in Lowndes County decided to stage a wildcat strike and walk off of their plantations. Eddie was one of a minimum of 3 men who were targeted by the sheriff, who assembled a white posse of vigilantes and shot him 19 times in the head and in the neck in order to send a message. The real story, again, is that this man was a militant willing to defend himself, and the reason that hundreds weren't killed is because men like him were standing by with a box of shotgun shells, which, as Lemon Johnson accurately said, they used in theory and in practice. The book Hammer and Hoe details Eddie Bracey's murder. According to Robin D.G. Kelly, Ed Knight and Ed Bracey were both communist organizers in Lowndes County SCU and established SCU locals from Hope Hole to Fort Deposit. In July alone, in Lowndes County, the committee of the SCU added 100 new members to its ranks. Liberal groups like the NAACP invariably fail to mention the radicalism of these groups. Do they have a guilty conscience for siding with the enemy through their silence? That's a video for a different day. But either way, these men were on the plantation of a man named J.R. Bell, apparently a tough driver who paid only 40 cents per every 100 pounds of cotton harvested and made sure his workers all stayed in debt. A strike was organized on August 19th, and when he woke up, he found his fields totally empty. In response, he called the sheriff, R.E. Woodruff, who brought up the deputies to a known SCU organizer named Willie Witcher. They asked him to call off the strike, and Witcher refused, so the cops told him he could go. He slowly turned around to walk back to his cabin, very apprehensive because these men were being pretty nice to him and he wasn't used to that, and as soon as he turned his back, the sheriff shot him through the thigh, cuffing him and literally dragging him back to the jail. He made sure that Witcher got no help for the bullet wound. That evening, Sheriff Woodruff organized a posse which scoured the county, committing atrocities against the strikers and non-strikers alike, and along the way, Jim Meriwether and his entire family, all Union members, were among the posse's first victims. As soon as that strike began, plantation owner John Frank Bates evicted the Meriwether family, forcing them to move in with Jim's brother, Philip. Then, on the night of August 22nd, Jim Meriwether was captured by the posse, accused of shooting a strikebreaker, and summarily executed. According to police reports, Meriwether miraculously broke away from 4 fully armed men, jumped into a nearby ditch, and picked up a shotgun, which he had allegedly planted there earlier. When he fired at the officers, and remember, these weren't officers, they were just posse men, Sheriff Woodruff claimed that his captors retaliated and killed him. The vigilante mob then forced their way into Philip Meriwether's home and continued its reign of terror against the rest of his family. Philip broke away from his captors and escaped down an embankment, but Jim's wife, Annie Mae, was not so lucky. She was stripped nude, probably sexually assaulted, and beaten with a knotted rope while she hung upside down in a wooden barn. Meriwether's murder was a part of a larger scheme to assassinate known Union leaders, most of whom had been identified by informants. At least according to the book, on Labor Day, Sheriff Woodruff and his posse fatally wounded SCU local leader Eddie Bracey as he tried to escape an ambush. And when I was looking for the grave of Eddie Bracey last time I was here, someone told me that most of the Bracey family is buried in the back of this cemetery. And you have the grave of World War I veteran, Private William Bracey. And a few days later, the body of Reverend G. Smith Watkins, a Baptist preacher and SCU leader, turned up riddled with buckshot in a nearby swamp. And here, about that Reverend, it says days later, on August 28th, police arrested G. Smith Watkins, a black preacher who helped to lead the strike. Reverend Watkins never reached the jail. He was found shot to death, lynched in a swamp near the county line weeks later. Now, obviously, this is an assassination carried out by the police. That other communist leader in the county, Ed Knight, luckily escaped a similar fate. When he returned back to his tiny shack late one evening, he found that his furniture had been smashed up by a mob, and they left a note on his door warning him that he was the next one to die. 3 unidentified, what the papers called transients, suspected of Union membership, were found dead in a nearby swamp, and dozens of people were rounded up and squeezed into the overcrowded jail in Haynesville. After these murders in Notasulga, a posse raided a woman's missionary convention, which they thought was a guise for a Union meeting, and assaulted several women in the process. And 3 days after Witcher's arrest, vigilantes flogged an elderly Lowndes County woman and her sisters for allegedly providing support for the strike.
Boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
anti-union repression was not limited to these rural areas. Searching desperately for the elusive Albert Johnson, Montgomery police arrested communists James Cobb, Charles Tasker, and James Jackson. After a brutal interrogation, Jackson and Tasker were ordered to leave Montgomery. Continuing their search, police located and arrested two Albert Jacksons, one of whom was the party's contact in Montgomery, and the other was just an old bootlegger who had no radical ties whatsoever. But when it was discovered that neither the bootlegger nor the Montgomery barber was the SCU leader, the Montgomery Police Department, in concert with the city's postmaster, tried to trap Clyde Johnson by refusing to accept payment for the union's post office box unless Albert Jackson appeared in person. Naturally, they wanted to kill him. And I'd just like to read this sign by the Mount Willing Church, because this was only put up in 2019 and who knows how long it's going to stay here. It was set up by the Equal Justice Initiative. It reads, "Enslavement and Racial Terror. The enslavement of black people in the United States was a brutal, dehumanizing system that lasted more than 200 years. Between 1819 and 1860, Alabama's enslaved population grew from 40,000 to 435,000. According to the U.S. Census, 2 out of 3 Lowndes counties, more than 27,000 residents, were enslaved black people in 1860. The county had the 5th largest enslaved population in Alabama and the 12th largest nationwide. Mount Willing Church was built at this site in 1832, constructed by enslaved people who were forced to sit in segregated sections when they attended service. Quote, "Slavery as it exists among us," read an October 1860 letter in the Hayneville Chronicle, quote, "is sanctioned by the Constitution, by the Bible, and it ought to be extended," end quote. White landowners committed to a myth of racial inferiority used the domestic slave trade to build an agricultural economy dependent on the exploited labor of black people. After the South lost the Civil War in 1865, many white people remained committed to white supremacy and determined to use violence to continue oppressing and exploiting black people. Between 1877 and 1950, white mobs lynched thousands of African Americans to intimidate black communities and enforce racial hierarchy. Of the more than 350 racial terror lynching victims documented in Alabama, at least 16 were killed in Lowndes County. And just to add my own note, on the opposite side of this sign, erected by the Equal Justice Initiative, it talks about the killing of Jim Press Meriwether, G. Smith Watkins, and Ed Bracey, who were killed in that strike in 1935, suspected of being communist sympathizers, something which isn't really talked about too often when people discuss the early history of civil rights. These people were radicals. And the author asks, well, how is it that the radical Sharecroppers Union, the SCU, was able to see many of their demands actually met without more of its leaders being killed? And Lemon Johnson, who was a member in very good standing with this Baptist church, picked up a copy of Lenin's What is to be Done and a box of shotgun shells, and he said, "Theory and practice." Behind me is the grave of Willie Claude, or W.C. Bates, plantation owner from Lowndes County and from a very prominent family around Fort Deposit. He was really wrapped up in putting down the uprising of 1935 alongside Sheriff Woodruff. He told a United Press reporter that after shooting at dozens of union workers and strikers at someplace between Calhoun and Sandy Ridge, they discovered a small cabin in the woods filled with an automobile load full of communistic literature concealed underneath the mattresses and in hiding spaces around the cabin, which they took to be the headquarters of the Sharecroppers Union, which was responsible for all the ills of the county. And the sheriff had some interesting insights on why they basically agreed to shoot on sight. Sheriff Woodruff said their pamphlets, quote, threatened them with death if they didn't join. So the posse viewed all union organizers as executioners of good, hard-working strikebreakers. In reality, they said join or die, which they took to be an imminent threat on their life. Anyway, a man named Cooter Roper was said to be the, quote, appointed executioner of the communists, and they blamed that man for shooting Jim Layden, who was a man refusing to go on strike alongside them. J.P. Meriwether was lynched as well in these events. They claimed that he was one of the executioners. When the posse went to go get a drink of water, quote, after searching for J.P. all day in the swamps, apparently J.P. Meriwether escaped their custody and found a shotgun he'd stowed away in a ditch. So they told the papers they they just had to kill him. This happened at the Bates' plantation, so it seems like they brought Meriwether to Bates' plantation and lynched him. The plantation owners claimed 3 communists from Birmingham hired Smith Watkins to distribute literature to black folks, so he was lynched in the swamp. In reality, G. Smith Watkins was just a local reverend. The sheriff claimed to the United Press that the white communists had several black gunmen force black workers to write into D.C. for federal assistance, in quotation marks, and for quote-unquote equality. And basically this was a common line that everybody took in the Deep South, that blacks were perfectly content until whites told them that there was a better way. And if these northerners and out-of-staters would simply mind their own business, the black folks down here in Lowndes County would just lie down and take it. And would you look at that, Lieutenant Air Corps, USA, Joseph Bell, who died December 17th, just a few days shy of his birthday, 1942, and Vincent H. Bell, Captain of Infantry, United States, who died November 29th, 1925. Behind me is the grave of Sheriff Robert E. or R.E. Woodruff and his wife Mildred. R.E. Woodruff seems to have been responsible for stoking a lot of the racial violence here in Lowndes County, and this one reporter with the news from United Press came to the county and asked at a general store about news of the strike. And as soon as he asked this, still basically taking cover underneath the awning from the rain, someone pushed a shotgun into his back and said, "Who are you? We'll string you up if you're one of those Reds from Birmingham." Eventually, the United Press reporter got to speak to Sheriff Woodruff, and the sheriff bragged about killing who he called a Union executioner, but he refused to detail who that executioner was, but claimed that this executioner for the SCU sent in a threatening letter. When the reporter asked to see the letter, the sheriff said, "I don't think I need to show it to you," and through context clues, it becomes very apparent all that letter was a list of demands to be able to join a union and for raising the pay from 40 cents a day to $1 a day. And keep in mind, this is back-breaking labor in the hot sun all day in 1935. $1 a day is more than reasonable. And by the end of the strike, underneath the leadership of Sheriff Woodruff, you had men standing around, armed guards, vigilantes, the same people that killed the Reverend and the 2 organizers, watching sharecroppers pick cotton underneath cover of darkness for their own protection. This was a reverting back to the days of slave labor, all to protect the interests of the black workers, who definitely wanted them to be there, and the only reason they didn't want to go back to the days of slavery is because of these hoity-toity leftists up in Birmingham. And this is exactly the kind of system that sheriffs like Woodruff created all throughout the Deep South.